Hi, welcome back. So you watched the other video and you were like, oh my goodness, I've learned so much. Photoshop's amazing. And if you already know Photoshop, you probably just skimmed through it. We're going to talk a little bit about layers and adding images into Adobe Photoshop. Now, if you are, just so you know, the next few weeks we are not using photographs, whether your own or sourced from the internet, for the first several weeks. We are only using things that are created within the software. So with that being said, we're going to talk a little about layers. We're going to learn about this. We're kind of going to put a pin on photographs for a second. We'll get into those probably around set 3 or 4, I believe. But we're going to talk about layers. So I had this image here of these chairs, these lovely chairs we looked at. And if I go to my layers panel over here, it says background. It has an eyeball and a lock. So that lock means it's locked. We can't move this layer at all. And it's going to say this when I hit cancel. And if I do this eyeball, it's going to hide the layer or not, but there's nothing, it's locked, so we can't really do anything with it. So the main question is, how do I bring something in? And there's several different ways. So over here I have some, with my video, some other images. I have a fox and I have some ocean. So one way is I can just drag this, and this works in Apple. I'm not sure if it works in the PC realm, so you may have to look that up. But this you kind of click and drag in. As you can see, my cursor is doing a plus sign because it wants to add. If I place it, it places it there. Now, there's a few things that we're going to look at first. First of all, this image is so tiny in comparison to my chairs. What gives? Now, we'll talk more about this in a couple weeks, but mainly all images are not created equal. You notice if you take images with your digital camera, those images tend to be a lot larger than the images that you take off the internet or even on your phone, and they all don't compare. So down the line, when we're working on sort of these like photo collage techniques, you're going to want all of your images to match. The next thing you're going to notice is there is a bounding box and some crosses here. This is how it's, since we placed it within an image, it wants to do a free transform or transformation because it does not match the intended size. Now, we can never make an image larger than it already is. Why? When you make images larger than they actually are, you are stretching those pixels out. Remember we looked in and we zoomed in all these little pixels? But we stretch them all out, and Photoshop has to invent new pixels and new colors for it to all work. And typically that ends up in sort of a blurry, lower quality image. And we don't want that. We want the crispest photographs, the crispest images that we can do. So we can never make things bigger. However, you can see with our mouse we can kind of pull it around. And for some reason, let's say I want this to kind of go between the two chairs. Am I done? No, because this bounding box is still there. And if I look in my control panel, I have my transform panel. I have the size of the pixels, the percentage size, the rotation, and a warping, which we can get into later, a cancel transform or a commit transform. So I can click this or hit enter on my keyboard and say I've committed this layer here. And there it is. And I can move it around. And as you can see, I have my smart guides on. If you don't have them on, if you go to view, oh, snap. Snap will do it. I'm thinking Illustrator right now. But as you can see, since I have my rulers, it wants to kind of measure things up. If I pull it this way, you can see it wants to see if I'm pulling it here, it could be parallel. And kind of doing things relative to other objects within the space. Now, if we look at our layers panel, we can see we have this new layer. It has a bunch of numbers, and that's sort of the title of the original image. it has this little guy here that makes it a smart object. So essentially, this thumbnail, this layer, is linked to the original file. Some people say this is great because if we make changes, we can always easily go back to the original state. Some people say it's not so great because you can't do any major changes. So it's kind of a toss-up for what you want to do. Typically, if I'm just placing things somewhere, I don't really mess with it. But if I need to really modify that specific image, then I want to edit it more. And then I would want to make it a non-smart object and rasterize that layer. We can look at that in a moment. What I'm really looking at is these eyeballs, and if we click on it, it hides it. And this could be helpful viewing and not viewing your layers down the line. You also have your opacity. We can change how opaque our layer is. And we're already making some adjustments already, just playing around with the opacity. There's a fill. So if you have a fill layer, this is what it does. When you start using brushes and fill layers, that will make more sense. And up down here, you have blending modes, which are very fun to play with. I always suggest getting used to them. So its blending modes are how light passes through the layer underneath. It's only affecting the layer is selected. As you can see, it does all sorts of different ways to adjust it. Kind of neat, fun to play around with. And I will post something that indicates all of what blending modes mean and whatnot. I'll make a PDF of sorts for that for y'all. Make a note for that. Now up here you have some other functions. Lock position, prevent auto nesting, and lock all. Typically we're not going to mess with them. I've been using Photoshop for over 15 years and I don't really mess with them myself. I'm going to unlock my background layer. And you can see that I can drag layers above and below and change the order. Knowing how to change the order and thinking about the order is really important. Whatever's on the very top of your stack, your layer stack, is what you kind of see first top down. So if you're kind of coming to a problem like, hey, why isn't this looking how I want to, always refer to your layers. So we're going to look at another way to open up images. So I have this fox picture here, and I'm just going to click it and drag it to the Photoshop icon there. And what it's going to do is just open it in a brand new tab. So I can see it. There's a new option over here. What you can do is you can do a Command A, Command C, click on the tab and what you're working on, Command V to paste, and I have the image. Now the fox image is way bigger. So I'm going to kind of zoom it down. So I'm going to do a Command Negative because I kind of want all of this extra space out here. Command Negative is zoom out, Command Plus is zoom in. I find it much more simpler to do that as opposed to taking the magnifying glass or going to the zoom in, zoom out, which is under View. Knowing your keyboard shortcuts is going to really minimize your time. So how do I make this fox a little bit smaller? He's way bigger than my chair picture. If I do a Command T or Control T, it's my free transform. Knowing how to do free transform is really important to get comfortable with it. As you can see, I have this bounding box, and I can move my object over. I can take any of these nodes and zoom in and out. I can pull it one way, I can pull it another. But if I go in my control panel, you can see my width and my height percentage is different. If I click on this lock, it sort of conforms them together, or you can hold down Shift as you scale. I always like to constrain my proportions, meaning I want these two numbers in my control panel to stay the same, so everything looks in perspective. Around unit set 6 is when we really think about perspective and adjusting it and warping it. But this is a way to kind of keep things where it doesn't look too off. And I can kind of scale down my fox wherever he may be. I can also, if I hold my cursor on the outside, you can see it kind of moves to these arrow keys, and I can rotate it in and out. Since I moved this center point, it's rotating off that center point axis. So if I zoom in. So if you can't really see, I'll put it over here. Over on this chair, right around where my cursor is circling, there is a crosshair circle. That's going to be where your axis is on for your moving. And that's where it's going to rotate to. Now, if you have an object where you need it to rotate on, which we'll do this one around set 5, this is going to make much more sense and play around with. And click confirm, and you kind of have this weird montage going on. And you can play around with layers, play around with stacking, and have fun with that. I can create a new layer. If I just go into this new page icon right here, take a new layer, and I can even do a brush tool. I can double click here to kind of change my colors. And I'm on this new layer. I never want to directly work on an image. I always want new layers. And I can kind of make something on a different layer. I can place on and off. One last thing we need to look at is layer styles. So if you double click your layer, the layer styles dialog box will pop up. And these are more options to play around. So I have this sort of hot pink outline I did on the fox. And I can do bevel and emboss and play around with different settings. There's a stroke and add an outline. That's kind of fun. And if you click on it, there's options. So I can change a blend mode of the stroke. I can change the color of it. I can change the opacity of it, the size, the position inside or outside. I can do inner shadow, inner glow, satin, which just kind of has this weird texture to it. If you go to, there's kind of different textures, kind of add this weird softness to it. Color overlay, which I like using a lot, gradient overlay, pattern, outer glow, drop shadow. And there's other effects to play around with. And before we end, we're just going to delete that layer. So if I go to this trash can, I can delete a layer. I'm going to delete that outline. I didn't like it. And I'm going to save my image. So I'm going to go to File, Save As. And here it's going to open it up. I'm going to name my file with my name _ Photoshop demo 01.psd. I'm saving a PSD because it's a Photoshop document file. Whenever I work in Photoshop, I always save a PSD. Why? Because you always want to go back and adjust your layers. Now, PSDs are not what you normally send to clients all the time, but sometimes you do. But you always save a PSD. Even in photography, I am always pulling up old PSDs because maybe I didn't like one adjustment, one part of a project. Instead of building it from scratch, I can make one tiny adjustment. And make sure that format just says Photoshop, and I'm going to click Save. Click OK. I'm also going to save a JPEG, a flattened image, and this will be helpful for sharing on the web. So go to File, Save As, Format. Now there's JPEG, JPEG 2000, JPEG Stereo. Just use JPEG. As you can see, my extension changed from .psc to JPEG, and the file name stayed the same. Click Save. This dialog box will open. I always make sure quality is maximized 12 and click OK. And I can check. And there is my file. So this is sort of a crash course introduction to the workspace of Adobe Photoshop. We'll get into more in depth later on. Definitely spend some time playing around in Photoshop if you're not familiar. There's also many other tutorials on YouTube or I think your other classes to definitely pay attention to. Our next video is going to be over on Illustrator, so if you're unfamiliar with Illustrator, definitely hop on over to those ones. And I'll see you then. Bye.